This episode is brought to you in part by the Apologetics Guy Show, the podcast that helps you find clear answers to tough questions about Christianity. Learn to explain your faith with courage and compassion. Join Moody Bible Institute professor Dr. Mikel Del Rosario at apologeticsguy.com.
This episode is part of a long series exploring how some evangelicals tie themselves to the Republican Party in the United States. It can stand on its own, but it'll make more sense as part of the whole season. In this episode, we'll cover what historian Rick Perlstein deemed the Boardroom Jacobins. The Chevy Corvair. It was small by automotive standards of the 1960s. Sleek. None of the big fins or filigree you'd expect from cars of that era. Sporty. Built for improved gas mileage and a low sticker price. But there was a problem. If the rear suspension compressed or extended as, suspensions are supposed to, it pulled the tires inward at a dangerous angle. Meaning that if you, say, took a sharp curve, only a small amount of the rear tires remained on the road. This caused the car to fishtail, and the driver could lose control. Some diehard enthusiasts argue that the car is fine if you know how to drive it. More than 100 lawsuits said otherwise. In November 1965, a young lawyer and researcher named Ralph Nader published a book, Unsafe at Any Speed, detailing the problems with the Corvair. And the book flopped. But that didn't deter some people in Washington. Senator Abraham Ribicoff held hearings about the Corvair. Nader outlined the issues in detail, from the suspension to how the rear tires were to be inflated to twice the pressure of the front ones, though that fact was buried in the manual. If the tires were not inflated properly, the car could flip. Then there was the issue that sharp metal knobs on the dashboard became like daggers in an accident, or that drivers might be impaled by the steering column in a collision. Industry fired back that the problem wasn't the design, but quote-unquote, the nut behind the wheel. This is an actor reading Nader's reply.
Civilized society should want to protect even the nut behind the wheel from paying the ultimate penalty for a moment's carelessness, not to mention protecting the innocent people who might get in his way.
Auto companies tried to frighten him, having him followed. They harassed Nader on the phone, even attempted to entrap him with prostitutes they sent his way. GM later confirmed that this was true. The industry's instructions to the detective they retained were this.
Our job is to check his life and current activities, to determine what makes him tick, such as his real interest in safety, his supporters, if any, his politics, his marital status, his friends, his women, boys, etc., drinking, dope, jobs, in fact, all facets of his life.
Nader won a $425,000 settlement. His book took off after a televised hearing. As a result, the National Highway Traffic and Motor Vehicle Safety Act passed through both houses of Congress unanimously. The Corvair was in trouble. This was not the only product investigated in that era. A new consumer protections movement was sweeping the country, removing poisonous materials, manufacturing safer clothing, and protecting rivers and streams from dangerous chemicals. That didn't sit well with everybody. These investigations sparked concerns in industry and big business. For decades, they'd been saying government regulation equaled communism, even though they're different things. In the 50s, industry groups failed to co-opt evangelicals and conservatives as a bloc to protect their bottom lines. Stop the spread of socialism. Now, in the 1970s, they redoubled their efforts and would fight unsafe at any speed at any cost. You're listening to the show that uses journalistic tools to look inside the Christian church. We press pause on the culture wars in order to explore how we got here and how we can do better. I'm Chris Starin, and this is Truths. We have a special guest for this episode, historian and author Rick Perlstein. If you can only read one item from the season, let it be his book, Reaganland.
One of the striking things about what I called in my first book, The American Consensus, Barry Goldwater and the Unmaking of the American Consensus, was how broadly shared America's prosperity was after World War II.
There are a lot of reasons for that shared prosperity. First, the government threw massive amounts of money into the economy as manufacturers built tanks, guns, airplanes, tents, boots, everything you need for a war. Not just for the US, but also for our allies. Second, and often overlooked, the US was on the other side of the world from the conflict. While Europe, Asia, and Northern Africa sustained heavy fire, we had few attacks on our soil, leaving our factories, shipping, railroads, and raw materials largely undisturbed. That economic prosperity was then shared with workers because so much of the country was unionized. About 1/3 of private sector jobs after the war were union, compared to around 6% today.
Corporate profits just kind of went up, and up in concert with wages going up and up. Productivity that workers were producing for the economy being seen in their paychecks at the end of every 2 weeks. And, the reason for this was, quite frankly, liberal social policies. It was unionization rates. It was things like those public works projects, that America were building dams. I mean, anyone who's a bass fisherman knows that all the big beloved bass fishing lakes, like Lake Fork in Texas, were all created by these kind of New Deal and post-New Deal dam projects, that followed on the TVA, right?
Our third reason for the boom? Federal spending on infrastructure during the New Deal. The New Deal was a series of plans under Franklin Roosevelt during the Depression. It built roads, dams, bridges, trails, housing, but also created things like the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation that protects your money sitting in the bank. All of these things encouraged prosperity. Mid-century, by and large, corporations played ball. In 1950, General Motors and the UAW signed the Treaty of Detroit. It promised annual cost of living adjustments, free healthcare, and became the model for thousands of other worker contracts. It came after a long strike that cost Chrysler $1 billion in sales. It wasn't out of the kindness of their hearts, to be clear. These labor gains were the product of decades of protest. It was a time of prosperity for corporations as soldiers returned from war and wanted houses, cars, and appliances for their family. It was also a time of prosperity for workers as unions offered them protections. But there were concerns as well. In 1917, the globe was shocked by the Russian Revolution, turning the largest nation in the world to a communist form of government. I covered this in depth in Season 3, but suffice it to say that what started with high hopes left a trail of death in its wake. The Soviet Union persecuted religious people, stifled thought and innovation, and killed tens of millions of its own citizens, as did China, as did North Korea. Reflect on that for just a second. Communism led to millions of deaths, many times that of the Holocaust. It was a legitimate threat to religious people because of the persecutions, and to those in big business who stood to lose their fortunes, giving religious people and industry a common enemy. Some people in the United States went on the hunt for domestic communists, seeing them everywhere. The House Un-American Activities Committee scoured Hollywood for subversives who could be sending coded messages through movies. Congressman Joseph McCarthy ran a reign of terror, accusing all kinds of people of being Reds in the U.S. government and the Army. Folks across the country were fired under suspicion of being communist sympathizers. Like I said, the Soviet Union was also anti-God. Americans responded to that extreme vision of atheism by drastically amping up ties between government and religion. It worked with the Ad Council to urge people to attend church or synagogue. God was added to the money and the Pledge of Allegiance. We erected monuments to the Ten Commandments around the country, launched the National Prayer Breakfast and National Day of Prayer. Things that some of us assume have always been around, and therefore we can point to them as why this is a Christian nation, when they haven't really been here all that long. Fear of communism opened a convenient door for those who wanted to break the backs of the unions, and or make more profits for big businesses, both because of its godlessness and its collectivism. And some eyes turned to the New Deal. You know, the government giving out large contracts, providing social safety nets, offering protections to labor, helping regular people. Big business decided to fight back. They argued that the New Deal was repackaged collectivism. In 1947, the Advertising Council, the people who created Smokey Bear, spent $100 million on a campaign preaching their notion of the American way, which boiled down to these 5 ideals.
The right to own private property, the free market, the profit and wage incentive, competition, government regulation, but not government control.
Some of the corporations that sponsored the campaign were Republic Steel, IBM, General Foods, General Electric, General Motors, Johnson & Johnson, Procter & Gamble, and Goodrich. You can view some of the ads online. One says, "Free enterprise, it's the American way." Another features a family putting in a concrete walkway in front of their single-story house with text reading,
"This is America, a nation with more homes, more motor cars, more telephones, more comforts than any nation on earth, where free workers and free enterprise are building a better world for all people. This is your America. Keep it free."
Consumerism is American. In Season 3, I highlighted James Fifield and his organization, Spiritual Mobilization. In the 1940s, it tried to engage ministers in pro-industry battles. A few decades earlier, many pastors were pro-union, and not just liberal ones. Fifield wasn't a fundamentalist, but a modernist. The National Association of Manufacturers made appeals to ministers for years, trying to win them over to industry. The problem they realized is that ministers didn't like having information just tossed at them. They wanted to be involved. They had to be made aware that they had skin in the game too. By 1945, 800 ministers were on board. Spiritual Mobilization was framed as an interfaith organization, this being the era when Judeo-Christianity was becoming a buzzword. It wasn't really an interfaith organization, but it sounded pretty good. This new effort was sponsored by people in high places at GM, DuPont, the Chamber of Commerce, chemical companies, think tanks, and J. Howard Pugh Jr., president of Sun Oil. According to historian Kevin Cruz, ministers really dug this thing, requesting literature from Spiritual Mobilization, including works like Friedrich Hayek's The Road to Serfdom. And this is kind of how weirdly incestuous this season gets. Hayek received money for his research from the Volcker Fund, an organization in which R.J. Rushdoony was a prominent employee. General Electric distributed a cartoon version of Hayek's book by the millions. It argued, according to Rick Perlstein, that when the government told businesses what to do, the result was slavery for everyone. The end of the cartoon shows a firing squad with this caption:
"What used to be an error has now become a crime against the state. Thus ends the road to serfdom."
All to push laissez-faire economics, especially that government regulation can only mess up business. This was music to the ears of big corporations. Companies like Coca-Cola and International Harvester, and trade groups such as the American Petroleum Institute, spent $50 million a year on this propaganda, half of it which went to fund textbooks that taught their agenda. Do you see how this all ties together? Education, big business, free market economics, fear of communism. I feel like one of those nuts with a pegboard that has red string connecting different bits of information. But yeah, all of the episodes this season are connected. These campaigns happened as think tanks pushed libertarian ideas not just on religious people, but the public at large. Anti-communism was a goal, but so was increasing profits for shareholders and breaking the unions. Yet, largely, it wasn't a rip-roaring success. At least, not yet. Eisenhower, a Republican, expanded Social Security, set up new government agencies, installed a new dealer as labor secretary, and increased the minimum wage. The advertising war was losing, but their time would come. Soon the money campaign of large corporations would find an audience, drawing some evangelical Christians into their orbit. We'll cover that after these commercial advertisements for what may be large corporations. While you listen to the ads, send a text to a friend to tell them you enjoy truce. It really helps people find the show. Okay, here we go. Hey friends, a few weeks ago I went to a fascinating talk where the guy who invented the infinite scroll told us about the future of AI. According to him, scientists are now predicting that we're just a few years away from the majority of the content on the internet being AI generated. It was a wild talk, and it reinforced to me how important it is to have real stories told by real people using reliable sources. And that's what Truce is. When it comes to fundraising, we're doing pretty well, but things are still pretty tight on this end. And I have a goal of someday hiring staff for the show. If you'd like to be a part of making Truce more sustainable, visit trucepodcast.com/donate. Even $10 a month goes a long way. Even if now's not the time for you to give money, there are so many ways to help out. For one, you can email your favorite history, religious, or chit-chat podcasts and suggest that they interview me for their show. 2, leave a 5-star review on your podcasting app. 3, post about Truce on social media. You can share an episode or one of the many videos I've been making on social media. Finally, and most importantly, remember the show in prayer. Thanks for listening to Truce, a real show made by a real person about real issues. Welcome back. There was an interesting term in the 1960s, the American consensus. In 1966, 85% of Americans agreed that, quote, government and business are learning to work together for the well-being of the country, end quote. It'll be a big shift from the 1960s American consensus to the 1980s, where Ronald Reagan got elected by saying,
"The 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help."
From government works well to government is the enemy. How we got there is a complicated story. From a narrative that the government and business are friends to one where they're adversarial. The role of what Rick Perlstein called Boardroom Jacobins, corporate leaders who resisted the government, is just one piece. But it's one we don't often cover. After the war, the American consensus held for a while. But that couldn't last forever. First, because it was held together with bribes and congressmen who owned stakes in the businesses they were tasked to regulate. This isn't all roses. Then there was a dramatic shift. Rick sets the break in the dam at 1967, and the battle over the Flammable Fabrics Act. For years, doctors reported that children were coming into hospitals with burns sustained while wearing supposedly flame-resistant fabrics. A CBS News commentator told the story of his 11-year-old daughter being burned nearly to death when a match accidentally dropped on her clothes. It didn't take much, and in an era where people smoked everywhere, flammable clothing was a danger wherever you went. The original act was written by industry men. The new legislation was much stricter. The day after it was approved, the Johnson administration passed the first updated meat inspection law in 60 years. The regulatory floodgates were open. Laws to prevent housing discrimination, restrictions on door-to-door sales, moving companies, updated inspection standards for fish and poultry, cigarette regulation. Consumer trust of corporate leaders plummeted. Politicians jumped in and ran whole campaigns based on their regulatory record. This was also the 1960s, a time of distrust in general. Protests, hippies, riots, and Ralph Nader, the guy from the beginning of the show. He assembled a team of young lawyers nicknamed Nader's Raiders, who revealed that the FTC was a toothless organization, not out to protect consumers. So President Nixon changed the leadership, and they started going after false advertising. This Republican president also signed a mine safety law, the National Environmental Policy Act, changes to the Clean Air Act, and the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, otherwise known as OSHA. All just as it was becoming politically expedient to do so. He even vetoed the 1972 Clean Water Act, but was overridden by Republican members of Congress. Republicans who voted for regulation. What could industry do? They fought back. At first with obvious heavy-handed attacks through mass mailings by the National Association of Manufacturers. The grocery manufacturers of America distributed kits and pre-printed letters that could be sent to legislators. And they had a champion, Ronald Reagan. In 1975, he began recording regular radio broadcasts, including at least one where he framed reformers as, and this is an actor reading the quote,
elitists who think they know better than you, What's good for you?
In another, he likened a planned consumer advocacy administration as reflecting George Orwell's 1984. Radio was a powerful tool in the hands of Ronald Reagan. He had help as inflation approached 7%, and the United States faced its first ever trade deficit. 20 years earlier, the country controlled 40% of the world's economy. By the 1970s, it was just 11%. That number takes some consideration because so much of Europe was still in rubble in the early 1950s, and we didn't have much competition, but you get the picture.
This kind of virtuous circle kind of starts breaking down in the 1970s. There are, very technical reasons that economists are still arguing about. One of the consequences is that corporate profits, quite frankly, start declining. CEOs, corporate managers, want that money back.
Industry, with Reagan's help, blamed regulation and guys like Ralph Nader. They also blasted environmental regulations that were coming into effect, saying they killed jobs. In reality, fewer than 100 factories had been shuttered, and many more jobs had been added in fields created by regulation: mass transit, waste management, water treatment, and the like. Still, even one factory can be used to bludgeon environmentalists if you want to spin it that way. Industry, spurred by falling profits, beat that drum.
And a very specific consequence of this was they became class conscious. They became politically organized. They started getting together and meeting and figuring out how they could break the back of the liberal policy elite in Washington. And if you look at the most striking statistic about this stuff, the number of corporate lobbyists in Washington in the 50s and 60s was absolutely minuscule.
According to Rick, in 1971, only 175 businesses had federally registered lobbyists. Within a decade, the number of lobbyists increased tenfold.
And the kind of questions they concerned themselves was, we want the government to buy our jet engine instead of our competitor's jet engine. It was zero-sum stuff. It was one corporation pitting itself against another. And the story I tell in my book, Reaganland, in this chapter called The Boardroom Jacobins, in which the Boardroom Jacobins are basically radicals who own and run corporations who are using very aggressive, very cunning political tactics to win the battle of public relations, are coordinating their attack on liberalism.
Liberalism like the War on Poverty or the Office of Economic Opportunity, making sure that cars that have a tendency to flip over aren't allowed on the market. Not to mention old fears about the New Deal.
They're forming ad hoc committees to destroy, for example, an agency that would have protected consumers' rights. They're coordinating to form ad hoc committees to defeat a labor law reform, which would have punished companies that broke labor laws by firing people who tried to join unions. This is the very labor reform that in kind of more prosperous and confident times, corporations had helped write in conjunction with labor unions. So that was the consensus, that unions and corporations and workers seemed to be working together for the common good. And once corporations decided that this was not sustainable, that they could not make money faster than the rate of inflation, they turned on liberalism and they began, for one thing, shifting their political giving, which used to be equally divided between Democrats and Republicans because you didn't want to anger either side if they had a committee, in Congress that regulated your industry, and started giving, 2/3, 3/3, 3/4 of their donations to Republicans. And even more importantly, and this is kind of where coordination with the new right comes in, they began supporting not incumbents, the people who served on these committees, but challengers. And often these challengers were much more conservative and much more radical. So on the one side, they're getting money from independent oil companies. They're getting money from Sears and Roebuck. They're getting money from General Motors. And they're getting small donations from members of, non-denominational churches in South Carolina. So the Reagan coalition is just that, a coalition.
A coalition of people who had been working together on and off to fight communism. Churches fought it because it was anti-God and got lots of people killed. business because it's bad for profits. Their mutual interests started with anxiety over communism. But that mutual push against Marxism allowed for some uncomfortable bedfellows. Like J. Van Andel, one of the founders of Amway, the largest pyramid-shaped MLM scheme in the world, who helped fund the work of people like Francis Schaeffer.
A company like Amway, the American way, has a certain vision of how the world works and how the economy works, which is each person is his own little CEO, right? Just so happens that this, kind of organization in Michigan gets a cut and very few people actually make a profit.
As a reminder, over 99% of people who get involved in MLMs will lose money. Just gotta slide that in.
But the idea that the economy, serves the public interest best when it's kind of a war of all against all instead of a cooperative commonwealth, this is something that all these people share. If you read Jerry Falwell's book, Listen America, with an exclamation point at the end, he cites Milton Friedman as often as he cites the Prince of Peace.
And here again is this melding of Milton Friedman and Christianity. Falwell and others like him preached deregulation, laissez-faire economics, lower taxes. And because some evangelicals with large followings like Falwell wanted to counteract communism, they clung to an extreme vision of economics to fight it, rather than embracing nuances in regulation or consumer protections. To recap, in the 1930s, the US government started the New Deal to pull the country out of the Depression. Included in the legislation, increased protections for unions and citizens. Depending on your viewpoint, this was either creeping socialism or the very thing that saved us from socialism. Big industrial trade groups like the National Association of Manufacturers joined forces with Christian groups like Spiritual Mobilization to tie business interests to evangelicals. It largely didn't work. By the mid-1900s, most Americans thought that government and business could work together. With falling profits in the 1960s and 70s, business interests and trade groups redoubled their efforts to regulate industry, as crusaders like Ralph Nader sought to protect Americans from faulty products. Armed with free market economics from people like Milton Friedman and a giant war chest, they launched a new campaign to use fear of communism to bring together unlikely groups, including some evangelicals like Jerry Falwell. They had a common enemy. Christians were uneasy with communism because of the atheism of Marx and the Soviet Union. Big business didn't like communism because they wanted to keep their profits. So the two joined forces, to the point where writers and preachers like Falwell blurred the line between doctrine and free market economics. And now, we're caught up. Remember the question I asked at the beginning of the season? What do we mean when we call something Christian or biblical? Some evangelicals increasingly found themselves declaring that small government, stronger military, support for industry, and less help for the poor and consumers were Christian concepts. Does the Bible say that? Can you point to chapter and verse and make the case for unsafe automobiles? No, that's silly. But people made that case anyway. In the 1960s, consumer protections were all the rage. But by the 1980s, consumerism, the drive for more and more stuff, became a virtue. The era of greed is good. Consumer protections were overtaken by consumerism. Hopefully you're beginning to see why I've spent so much time tying economics and social movements into this season. Because when Falwell cites Milton Friedman in the minds of some, it can seem like laissez-faire capitalism and the Bible agree with each other. In reality, the Bible does not argue for free market capitalism, or socialism or communism. But fear of communism pushed some Christians to hold tight to a certain vision of capitalism, even as protections for Americans were eroded. This story of how some evangelicals tied themselves to the Republican Party has a lot to do with money, taxes, economics, easy answers. Nobody here is talking about destroying businesses. Don't miss that. But in the 1970s, a lot of money and lobbying power was spent to court politicians, the press, and evangelicals with large followings. And soon, the White House. Special thanks to Rick Perlstein for his interview, and for his amazing books Reaganland and The Invisible Bridge, both of which were heavily referenced in this episode. I'm also indebted to One Nation Under God by Kevin Cruz, which covers a lot of the Cold War stuff from this episode and Season 3. A full list of sources is in your show notes and on the website at trucepodcast.com. Once there, check out the archives and learn how you can help me make this show. Your financial help, even $10 a month, goes a long way. That's trucepodcast.com/donate. Or find me on Venmo at @trucepodcast or Patreon and PayPal. Special thanks to the people who gave me their voices for this episode, including Chris Sloan, Lauren Fry, and my friend Dave Monroe. Truce is a production of Truce Media, LLC. God willing, we'll talk again soon. I'm Chris Starin, and this is Truce.